December 25th, 1914. The guns fall silent. For many, it is a temporary stop in the violent war that has been raging for several months and still has several years left. An impromptu truce across the Western Front and various areas of the Eastern Front has brought an end to the fighting. Men who were once enemies the day before trying to kill each other are now fraternizing in no man's land. And in other parts of the front, it's merely just a ceasefire. Why this happened is something many people are still trying to figure out. How something like this could occur is something that many still don't understand. It's been talked about to death, from Sabaton songs to movies to even commercials. The Christmas Truce is an iconic part of World War I. Many people who don't know even the basics of the First World War know of the Christmas Truce. It has become something that is just part of our culture as humanity, showing the understanding and the want for peace that comes out of even the most barbaric conditions. But there's one thing not talked about. The possible implications that the Christmas Truce could have had on the war that might have brought about the end of it even sooner. I'm the Wolf of 1918, and in this video, I'm going to take a look at some of the more unknown factors that played into the Christmas Truce and some of the reasons the head generals were so quick to put a stop to it as soon as they could. In late December, and there's even reports of it happening as early as late November, soldiers on the Western Front were starting to have these miniature truces with each other in order to celebrate Christmas. In some sectors, the British or the French would start it or come up with the idea to have this stop in the fighting, and in other sectors, it was the Germans. In some, it happened out of nowhere, where the British were terrified that the Germans were about to launch a sneak attack on Christmas, and a patrol sent to investigate it were greeted by friendly Germans giving them Christmas gifts. Obviously, that is just legend, and there's really no confirmation that that happened, but it'd be very, very cool if that was the case, so I like to believe that that is true. But the uncommon factors that play into it, the uncommon ideas, the things not spoken of it often, are the reasons why the generals were so quick to put a stop to it. Now, obviously, there was the fear that, oh crap, these people are going to fraternize and now we won't be able to have a war anymore. But things that happened in a similar fashion during the American Civil War show that that isn't necessarily the case. And fraternization between the troops had been happening since the War of Maneuver had ended. So it wasn't exactly anything new, it just hadn't happened on such a large scale. So it wouldn't be extremely terrible to say or to assume that this was a one-time thing. However, the generals were so terrified that they made it policy to avoid anything like this from happening again. Even miniature truces were much more difficult to have happen, and it took a lot more sleuthing around from the officers themselves, even in areas where there was no major truce. Why is this? What were the implications that the Christmas truce could have had that terrified the generals so much? This is going to take going several steps backwards, and I'm going to do this multiple times. So please bear with me as I try to give you a brief Cliff Notes, Wikipedia copy-paste in the style of Mark Felton on the history of this and why it's crucial to understanding the Christmas Truce and why it happened and why there was such a panicked reaction from the upper general staff. So way back in the 1860s, there was a revolution in Poland. This is something I'm going to get to when I finally continue the Lighting the Powder Keg series, so I'm not going to go into super amounts of depth in it right now. However, this revolution was partially caused by the Industrial Revolution and the working class conditions in Poland that Russia was sort of just allowing to happen. This inspired many people who saw this in Germany, France, and Britain, many of these people trying to help the working class who were suffering through horrific conditions in factories and mines, to just sort of create something for the working class, to have a say in how their working conditions were improved. This became known as something along the lines of the Workers' International. This international organization was supposed to be something that was not affected by national borders. At the time, nationalism and just the idea of my country's better than yours was very prevalent. And so something like this happening was rather uncommon and insane that it ever occurred in this time period. Now, obviously, Germany didn't exist yet, but the German states were very big on this idea as well, and it was very prolific throughout there. It grew to a point to where, Karl Marx was from this region. He was a German. So you have this large amount of people within all of these states joining together in solidarity for workers' rights. And this lasted for about 15 years or so. It dissolved in 1879 or 1876 or somewhere around in that region when there was a lot of disagreements on what to go forward with. Anarchism had taken off in pop culture, and you had this huge divide between the two people who you had one group saying that, hey, the current governments we need to keep. It's just the conditions in the factories and these people extorting the working class that need to be stopped. And you had the anarchists saying, destroy the whole system, we need to restart. This caused a split, and then there was several branches of each of these guys, and it grew into just a complete mess, and no one liked each other, and the thing dissolved. About 10 years later, the Second International was formed, sort of as a, hey, now that heads have cooled, let's create something new. It took on policies such as anti-militarism, as with the creation of Germany and suddenly this huge power divide in Europe, you now had a situation where it became evident that a massive European war could happen at any moment. Now, obviously, this is around 30 years before such a war would actually occur, but it was one of those things that people suddenly started to worry about. There hadn't been one since Napoleon. Tensions were very high, especially since Germany had just formed and kicked France out of Alsace-Lorraine. So suddenly people are worried that there's possibly a new war on the horizon. So anti-militarism became a huge deal with the Second International. And it just continued to grow. It became huge in Germany, France, Britain, Russia, Austria, Italy, even Belgium and the lowlands. Those countries had a large amount of people in the Second International, people who supported it and were willing to do whatever it took to have their needs met. What is important is that this group was formed and it only grew in strength as the decades went on. And in 1914, it was a huge, unified, multinational organization. The entire thing had this whole idea that if war broke out, the people in their nations would strike. They wouldn't work for the war industry. They wouldn't go to their mustering stations. If they were in the military due to conscription, they would just basically refuse to do anything and stop any European war from occurring. It was one of those anti-monarchist, anti-nationalism movements that was just this grandiose plan to stop a war that the people did not approve of. Well, obviously that didn't work. On June 28th, 1914, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia were killed in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip. They were funded by Serbia, and Austria went to war against them in sort of a pseudo, we need to control the Balkans sort of way, let's use this as a good excuse. Russia defending Serbia, and so on and so forth, resulted in the First World War. So what happened? Why in the world would such a large organization that was so anti-military suddenly just not do anything at the start of such a large conflict that is obviously being started for imperialistic ambitions? Well, that's the problem. Not very many people saw it as that. And in almost every single country, the people were convinced that they were fighting for their own self-survival, for their own national survival, that they were the ones being attacked. The Russians were convinced that the Austrians were only trying to be greedy and push Russia out of the Balkans, and that Russia had to defend Serbia. In Austria, the Austrians were convinced that it was Russia who had told Serbia to attack them, to take out their heir, and that Austria needed to have revenge on Serbia, and now Russia's attacking them for simply getting revenge? Germany was convinced France and Russia were trying to attack them for merely supporting an ally. France was convinced Germany was using this as an excuse to attack Russia and take them out before they grew too large, which was partially true, and that they were trying to completely eradicate France from the map, which wasn't exactly true. The Belgians obviously were fighting for self-defense, and the British were convinced that they were fighting for the defense of democracy, which doesn't make any sense when you look at Imperial Russia and some of the other nations that Britain was allied with. But what matters is the perception of the populations who would have the ability to strike, and they were convinced they were fighting for self-defense, not for the goals of imperialistic figureheads leading their nation into destruction, leading their young generation, their sons, into a slaughterhouse. But how did this perception come about? Especially with how anti-war some of these people were and how large some of these factions were to where they said no war no matter what. Well, one individual, the head of the French chapter, I guess you could call it, of the Workers' International, the Second International is what it was called, he met with the leader of the German International in Belgium. There was a conference leading up to the war, and he basically pledged solidarity. He said, we are going to stop this war no matter the cost. Both of them were involved in their state policies, so he pledges his solidarity with the leader of the German faction, making plans to continue to oppose the war and the French government. Now, at the time, the German people and the French people were both anti-war. They didn't really like this whole idea of going to war for supposedly Austria's problem. Why should they? That doesn't make any sense, especially against France, who doesn't seem to have any part in this. However, the French government wanted to support Russia, mainly in order to curb Germany. It's a very complicated situation, and I'm going to go over it more. It doesn't matter too much right now for this discussion. So, effectively, you had a people group, these peoples who did not want to go to war, but the governments did. And you have a couple individuals who are fighting to basically stop the war from happening and trying to provoke these general strikes. Now, the leader of the French faction, Jean, Jean, I can't pronounce French very well, so you'll have to forgive me. I think I say that in every single video that I do. He effectively goes to the French government and he attempts to stop the war from happening. He almost gets arrested, and he's basically making continual plans to oppose the war over and over again, and he has a ton of support from the population. So one day, he's sitting at a cafe in Paris, and he gets assassinated. The person who assassinates him has the ironic last name of Villain, which is kind of funny to me, just because of how ironic history can be in so many ways. This causes a near complete collapse of the French government and people. The only thing that stops it is the fact that there's a war about to happen. And so France uses his assassination and the fact that he no longer has a voice to say that he would have wanted the war, even though he was a staunch opposer of it, and saying that this is why we need to go to war. Go to war in his memory. And it unites the French people, and they go to war with this whole idea of revenge and taking back Alsace-Lorraine, and it puts France at a breaking point where they had those two options. They either completely collapse into domestic turmoil, or they go to war almost fully unified. And the French government was able to play it in such a way to where they were able to go to war fully unified. His death is pointed to by many World War I historians as sort of the no turning back point. There was no way to avoid a First World War once he was killed. That was the last chance that they had. So with war going on, people realizing how terrible it is, and reports of Germans talking to the British asking, why the heck are we even here? Why are we even still fighting? Bored, done with the war, seeing their friends get torn to shreds, that romanticism has been destroyed. The Christmas Truce happens. These people who were 8 months ago fully willing to fight their own governments to avoid an international conflict went to war with rose-tinted glasses and have now had them ripped off their faces in a blast of artillery. And now they're talking to the enemy. Now they're playing football with the enemy. They're trading gifts with the people that they had pledged to strike with. And the general staff is terrified. This was where it could have changed. Maybe had the truces been larger, maybe had there been less of a language barrier, and maybe, if something had changed just a little bit, it could have resulted in a soldiers' strike, a total, complete strike across all fronts of the war. Maybe. Probably not. But that's an unrealized potential, an unrealized implication that the Christmas truce could have had. Something that could have gave to force the war into an early end where no one really wins or loses. You have a sudden change of international policies and probably a sudden change in governments for a lot of these nations. No way that would have suddenly left things as they were before the war. Once the first gun was fired at the start of that war, there was no way to return back to what it was like before. The idea of a major event happening globally or on a continental landmass, any idea that things could return to the way it was before that, are merely romantic thoughts. It's just not possible. However, that truce was the closest the world got to peace until November 11th, 1918. That right there, that truce could have been a breaking point. And that's why the General Staff panicked. That is why there was such a staunch and sudden, basically just a stoppage of the truce, a resumption of the fighting as soon as possible. In some areas of the front, the truce lasted into January before it was finally forced to stop by the High Command when they figured out that area of the front was not fighting each other. These people did not want to fight. They did not want to continue the war. They were forced to. And had it just been a little bit more, had they resisted just a tiny bit more, it could have actually ended the fighting. It's one of those great unknowns, one of those things that you can think about and just mule around in your mind, but it doesn't really matter, does it? It happened over 100 years ago. It happened about 107 years ago, this December 25th. And yet people still talk about it. It's one of those amazing things that continue to happen. It happened because these people didn't want war. They wanted a return to normalcy. They were duped into fighting, and they realized it. They wanted to feel like they were back home. So they left their trenches. They met with the enemy that they had just been trying to kill the previous day, and they hung out. Those who could talk to the other people, they traded stories. They traded gifts. They played games. There's legends of, massive football matches with no rules being played, with, in some, the British winning several hundred to the Germans several hundred, and in other cases, flip-flopped. It's an incredible story, often compressed into a tiny, neat package of just some people having a little bit of humanity on Christmas. That's a cool story in of itself. But it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't tell the entire background of it. Why? Why then? Why not ever again? We don't really hear of Christmas truces happening in even similar style conflicts. Nothing like this happened before and has happened since. And that's why it's so fascinating. See, if it was a standard that people just did that, no one would ever talk about it. It'd just be another blip on the radar. But because it was unique, everyone wants to just talk about it and write about it and make movies about it and make commercials about it and make songs about it and make YouTube videos discussing the topic every year. But no one ever really can answer the question as to why. And I think that I can explain it well in simply that was the culture. There was a lot of anti-war sentiment among the soldiers fighting this war, and it only grew when the War of Maneuver ended. See, at the outset, everyone has these rose-tinted glasses. It's going to be over by Christmas. That Christmas. And in that snow-covered field, they were still sitting in dirty, frozen, mud-covered trenches with the rotting bodies of their friends merely inches below the surface at best. They wanted some sense of normalcy, to not feel alone and isolated. They wanted solidarity. They did not want war. Hopefully, this video brings to light some unknown factors of the conflict of the First World War, some unknown things that play into the First World War and into the Christmas Truce, and explain just exactly why the Christmas Truce happened, why it was such a big deal, why it's still talked about, and why it was stopped so harshly by the general upper staff, or the upper general staff. I'm sorry, I can't talk today. It was unique. It hasn't happened again. Did not happen before, and I don't think it ever will. The generation that was lost fighting in the trenches of the First World War was irreplaceable. And for many, on December 25th, 1914, that was their last Christmas. And many knew it. So, if you can, take a moment this Christmas and just remember their legacy, what they've left behind. For many of these men, they're nothing more than an unmarked piece of concrete or stone. For many more, they're relegated to the tomb of the unknown soldier here in the States, in Britain, or in France. Others are relegated to simple pillars that are constantly vandalized in Germany, being mistaken for Nazis. Take a moment in remembrance. None of these people wanted to fight. They were dragged into a war of destruction. It is an important lesson far too many miss.
my God.